Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video. In this video, I'll be doing a review of CD Projekt Red's latest game, a game filled with controversy, and that is Cyberpunk 2077. And this is not a video I planned on making. This is a very impromptu video here, unlike my other spoiler reviews I do. This one is mostly unscripted. But I just felt like I had a decent amount of thoughts from playing this game, enough to warrant a video, and I literally just finished playing the game. So yeah, let's talk about it. Now obviously, again, as I said, there's a lot of controversy with this game, with its performance on consoles, and I will say that I did play this on a base PS4, which ran very wonky. And there's really no way around it. It's like, yeah, the game runs terribly on a base PS4, but to be honest, I personally was expecting that. Especially like after there were some rumors that came out like a few weeks before the release of the game where they were saying, oh, they keep on delaying the game because they haven't polished the last gen versions of the game. And again, not surprising. So like I bought this game knowing it was going to be a glitchy mess at launch, and it was. But to be honest, my experience with this game hasn't been nearly as bad as a lot of other people. And I know there's some people that are even playing this on a PS5 that have had enough glitches to the point where they just want to stop playing the game. And I get it. But again, my personal experience with this game wasn't that bad. Now, there was definitely some glitches at points. There were only 2 crashes. I mean, a lot of people talk about how this game crashes all the time. I only got 2 crashes my entire playthrough, which I did rush through the main story. That took about 18 hours. I did do a couple side quests here and there, but for the most part, this was me just kind of blowing through the story, and a lot of that was because of how glitchy the game was, and because of that, I decided, you know what, let's play through the game all the way this time. I will come back to the game after the patches are come out, replay the game, do all the side content then. And I felt like for the most part, the main story missions weren't that glitchy. The majority of the glitches that I personally got came from the open world. And there's a lot of textures not loading in right away where you literally see them load in right in front of you, which is funny. There's times where a vehicle or a person just spawns out of nowhere. There's times where a character's like T-posing because their animations haven't loaded in. Like there is some very wonky stuff within the world, but from my experience of just blowing through just the main missions, like I felt like a good chunk of them were pretty polished. But even through just playing the main missions, there were definitely points where you get massive frame rate drops during combat. There's times where like just out of nowhere I would die and I would have no clue how I died, like what just happened. Like there are definitely some moments within even the main story that aren't great, but for me, again, the experience as a whole was probably the best that it's going to be coming from playing a base PS4. Let's talk about the game itself. And the game for me, I personally came into this doing almost no research. I didn't watch any of the gameplay that was out there for Cyberpunk. I decided to just come into this completely blind, and coming into the game, I was expecting this to be a first-person Cyberpunk version of The Witcher, and that's not really what we got here. And what we got here is essentially a Cyberpunk version of Fallout. In many ways, this is probably one of the better Fallout games I've ever played in terms of narrative, in terms of gameplay abilities, though obviously the way that the game runs kind of harms that. But I do feel like Cyberpunk here is a very solid game. The problem is it's not finished. It should have been delayed. But really, again, like in many ways, this game reminds me of that Fallout formula. I mean, first-person shooter, RPG, a pretty robust RPG system that, to be honest, I barely even delved into. Dialogue choices, branching narratives, like that sort of thing that you would expect from Fallout. And not saying that it's a bad thing, but at the end of the day, it's like Cyberpunk and Fallout and like games like that just simply aren't for me necessarily. I mean, I enjoy those games. Those are fun games. I enjoy the narratives within those games, but they're not really games that I would consider some of my all-time favorite games. For me, I'm much more of a third-person action-adventure game focused around story person. Again, while Cyberpunk isn't really that style of game, I do think it is one of the best within that other style that I'm personally just not as into. And we can talk about the open world of the game, which is, I think, fundamentally strong. I think when you look at the open world, like the entire city of Night City, there are points even within my playthrough on the base PS4 where it does feel like a living, breathing place. I do think some things that did let me down a bit, though, is one, it's a much smaller map than I was expecting. I mean, when like most objective markers within the main story can be gone to in like a few minutes at most, it's like it really makes the scale of the map feel relatively small. Also, I do feel like there's a lot of interactivity mechanics that I expected to be in the game that really just aren't. There aren't nearly as many things that you can interact with as I was expecting, and even those that you can interact with, a lot of them just lead to like a one-line response from a character, which doesn't really do much. Like, it really just feels like this game was unfinished to the point where like even the open world isn't as expansive as what it could have been if they had been given more time, been able to add elements like more optional dialogues, more places where you can just interact with the world. I feel like that was something that was very much needed within this game as well. Now, while I haven't played a lot of the side quests within the game, I do hear that the side quests are some of the best parts of the game, and I think you can definitely see that when playing some of them. Like, I played a Judy side quest, I played a Pan Am side quest, and you can definitely tell the level of quality within those quests that feel very much like that of the main story and involve characters that come from the main story. And I do like the streamlined nature of the game, and this is something that I complain about in many games I've talked about on this channel. I think even very recently in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, one of my biggest complaints about that game is just how bloated the game is. Cyberpunk actually does this well, where again, you can just run through the Johnny Silverhand's part of the story, like the main story of the game, but if you want to, you can do all these other quests with some of these characters that you meet along the way, and I feel like that's the approach Valhalla should have taken, but it didn't. But at the same time, I don't like, one, how the side quests are presented within the game, as in like we have this massive mission log that's just very hard to navigate through, and you're presented with like a billion missions at once. And by the time I finished the game, I probably had like a good 20 to 30 side quests in my log, and that's just kind of ridiculous. Plus, also, I don't like the fact that there's just random points within the story where you're going to get a call from certain people that will give you side quests, and this sometimes happened to me within main quests, like during a somewhat important narrative moment where like I'm talking with Takamura, just walking down, and he's giving me exposition, and then all of a sudden I get this phone call and it forces me to listen to the phone call at the same time I'm getting the exposition from Takamura. Like, that's pretty bad. Now, that's most of what I have to say about the gameplay. Now let's move on to the story, where obviously you play as V. Now you can play as a female or male version of the character. I went with the male version during this playthrough. The plan is to go with a female version on my replay when I eventually get around to that, but that will be later down the road. But I did like the male version of V. I mean, I liked his voice acting. One of the most dynamic performance in the world. Like, I think it does the job. But again, we started the game with the character creation, which felt very weird. It's really strange how it felt like they went very in detail on like things that don't matter, while like kind of ignoring some pretty big things. But you also start the game by choosing your life path, and this was kind of pointless. I was actually really underwhelmed with how this worked out, because I was really expecting CD Projekt Red, of all teams, to be able to create a game where your choices mattered, and these life paths obviously being one of the biggest choices you make within the game, to really change up the story, and it doesn't really do much. Like, I personally picked Street Kid, and from what I understand, like, these life paths, all they do is change the first mission that you do within the game, because obviously that's your starting point. Then they all lead to you meeting up with Jackie and then having a flash forward, and by that point, the rest of the game is pretty much the same outside of random dialogue here and there that you can choose because of your background. Like, it's a very deceptively dull system where, again, you would think that it would be a very important system and it would be very important to how your story plays out, but it really just doesn't matter. Well, with that said, let's start talking about the base narrative itself, which I actually really liked how it was structured. Again, it is broken up into your typical 3-act structure. Act 1 does your typical fare of introducing characters and the world and the conflict that you're going to obviously deal with in Acts 2 and 3, and I think it does a very solid job with it. I really love the character of Jackie Wells. I thought he was a really great sidekick character, and was really disappointed where he ends up dying by the end of Act 1, but I thought those were really great scenes. I really like this initial setup for Act 1 as well, where like we're trying to pull off a heist. We investigate Yonobu, we go break into his place, try to get the relic. Obviously, things go wrong, and that ends up leading to Act 2, but I did like this initial setup for the story, though. I mean, something I haven't talked about in the gameplay section that I might as well talk about now. I really hated the brain dances. I mean, this was something that really, from my understanding, only occur in the main story, and even then it doesn't happen that often, but they're really annoying. And I found this first one here with Yonobu, when you're doing his investigation, to be really just confusing, where essentially you have this set amount of footage to run through, and through that you have to find clues and find out where the relic is and everything. And I just found this section to be really just boring and monotonous, and even got to the point where towards the end I just decided to look up a guide. Like, I just couldn't be bothered with it. But Act 1 ends with obviously the death of Jackie Wells, but also V having to save the relic by inserting the biochip into his head, which is where we get introduced to Johnny Silverhand, also known as Keanu Reeves. And I was mind blown at how much Keanu Reeves was in this game. I really thought he would just be some random side character that would show up here and there. I didn't think he would be a major portion of the game, like pretty much the second main character of the entire game, where for the rest of the game, I mean, Keanu Reeves is in V's head, and we talk to him throughout the entire game. Now, while your relationship with Johnny Silverhand, I believe, can be radically different based on the choices that you make, I personally decided to be antagonistic towards him. I decided to do everything within my power to get him out of V's head. And it does lead to a lot of fun banter between the two. But we do end up spending the majority of Act 2 trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. Where due to his biochip, V only has a few weeks to live, and his personality is going to end up being replaced by Johnny Silverhand's if he doesn't figure out how to stop it. So we spend the majority of Act 2 trying to stop it. I do like how Act 2 is structured. Again, it's kind of similar to The Witcher 3 to a degree, where again, you have multiple storylines going on at once that you can do in any order. Where you had this storyline revolving around Takamura, where you help him take down Yorinobu. I really like Takamura as a character as well, though I do feel like the ending to his story was kind of abrupt. You have the storyline of Pan Am, who I also found to be a very likable character. And while those missions for me personally took probably way too long, her questline was probably one of the more notable ones within the game. You also learn more about Johnny Silverhands during this section of the game as well, where you have this flashback sequence with him and Alt Cunningham, and you learn about the Soul Killer, and all this is really, really strong. I really liked Act 2, both narratively and gameplay wise and structure wise. Like, I really loved most of what they did here. And really, Act 2 is the bulk of the game. I would say that Act 2 probably took me a good 12 hours out of my 18-hour playthrough. But this obviously leads to the end game, the final act, where Takamura is killed, which again, I found pretty anticlimactic. But again, my playthrough, I don't know if this changes for anyone else. I did make a deal with Hanako, and through that, worked with her in order to take down Yorinobu without the help of Johnny Silverhand, which again, I don't know how the other playthrough turns out, but I will guess that probably the other side of things probably feels more satisfying from a narrative perspective, because I do feel like through this ending that I got, a lot of the characters from before this within the game don't appear. And I feel like if I were to side with Johnny Silverhand and had teamed up with Rogue and all these other characters, I feel like the ending would have been a lot more satisfying for me personally than the ending that I actually got, which felt very isolated from the rest of the game, as we're spending these characters that we barely got to know. Well, we had this final boss battle with the Smasher, which was a massive pain, but got through it. Through this, we take down Yorinobu, and the actual ending that I got felt kind of just out of left field to a degree, where for some reason V is taken to space to do testing and everything, where it's found out that he's going to die anyway, and this sequence just goes on for way too long. But at the very end of the game, we essentially get this choice where, because V is going to die anyway, we either get to sign a contract where he agrees to turn himself into an AI, or he returns to Earth to live out the rest of his days. And I decided to go with the latter of that. I personally felt like it just felt kind of anticlimactic if he were to end up as an AI, this thing that he despised throughout the entire game. So I decided to go for this other ending where he ends up being free and gets to live out the rest of his days, which is probably just a few months, but still better than nothing. But yeah, that's my experience with the narrative of this game. I really enjoyed this game's narrative. I think first act is pretty strong, and you get to really become friends with the character of Jackie Wells, and he's just a really great character in my eyes. And then we get the second act, which is really great, but for a completely different reason. Because while Act 1 does set up why you're in the situation that you're in by the time of Act 2, a lot of the individual story threads from Act 1 don't really have that much of an impact on Act 2. And your actual motivations for things that you're doing in Act 2 are radically different from that in Act 1. So they're really enjoyable story arcs either way. Act 3 for me, again, was kind of weird. I obviously, a lot of it is decided based on the decisions that you make previously in the game, and I think in an ideal world, I probably would have gotten a different ending. I think I probably would have sided with Johnny Silverhands if I were to redo this, but at the end of the day, I'm pretty content with the ending that I got. But that's most of my thoughts on the game itself. Again, for the most part, I really enjoyed the narrative, and it's really what kept me going with this game, and really what got me to finishing this game. Because again, gameplay-wise, it's not really a game for me. Again, it's not actively bad, but it's just not really a thing that I'm super invested in, especially when we had as glitchy of a game as this was, where while my experience wasn't as bad as many other people, I mean, I still got glitches and some points where frustrations came out of things just not working properly, and that's a lot of what decentivized me to play a lot of the side content in this game, where again, I would like to play all the side content because supposedly that's the best part of the game, but I'm just going to wait until later down the road after the patches are out to actually do a playthrough where I do that. On a base level, if you're taking the glitches out of it, is a solid game. Like, there is a great game within Cyberpunk here. It's just not fully realized, largely due to, in my opinion, it being released too early. CD Projekt Red should have put a few more months worth of time into the game, and I feel like by then they could have had a really polished, really solid first-person RPG, but instead what we get is a pretty buggy mess that has a lot of really strong groundwork there. Again, overall, it is a really strong game, probably the best game that I've played within the genre that it's in. It's just that genre is not really something that I'm super acclimated to play. But that's my review for Cyberpunk 2077. Again, a very impromptu video. I know this video kind of goes all over the place. It's not a well-structured video, but I literally just finished the game and just sat down and started recording my thoughts here. So that's it for Cyberpunk. Still got a lot of games to play from the year of 2020 that I need to play before I get around to doing my 2020 year in gaming video that I would like to do at some point within next year, kind of like I did for 2019 this year. And there might be some other videos associated with those games along the way as well. So stay tuned for those. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.